All good? I said yesterday that this Jobs for Mates scandal stinks. Well, today the stench just got a whole lot worse. Under fierce questioning this morning, Jacinta Allen has confessed that she had at least 2 conversations with her departmental secretary about Mr Weimar's appointment before the announcement of his appointment was made. So the question now arises, what pressure, directly or indirectly, did Jacinta Allen place upon her departmental secretary to make sure her mate got a job without any merit selection criteria or interview process on a salary of over $500,000 in circumstances where her mate was, along with her, responsible for the Commonwealth Games debacle, one of the most humiliating setbacks for Victoria's reputation for global events and an economic and reputational basket case. That's what we have here. Jacinta Allen trying to find a job for a mate who has much responsibility for the Commonwealth Games debacle, as she does, and his reward, a job without an interview process, carrying a salary of $500,000. Let's remember, this type of political interference and jobs for mates culture was a very thing Victoria's Ombudsman was investigating last year. She found in her report that too many senior appointments were made without a proper process. People being handpicked, why? Because they're mates of the Premier or some other minister? Not the way to run our great state. With all appointments of this nature, there should be a process around them. And what's more, that process is important not only because it's fair to have a process like that. A process of interviewing potential candidates is important so you can make sure you get candidates with the requisite skills to do the job. One of the reasons why Commonwealth Games was such a debacle is that we had a minister in Jacinta Allen who brought no requisite skills to that job. But we also had Jerome Weimar, who had no record of service in the delivery of major events, who was put in charge also. What did we end up with? The humiliating cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. Now, what do we have here? A few months later, we have a housing crisis in Victoria. It's worse here than anywhere else in the country. And what does Jacinta Allen do? Her focus should be on making sure that we get best people for jobs, particularly in areas that are there to address the crises that Victorians are facing. Instead, what do we get? In the midst of a housing crisis in Victoria that's worse than anywhere else in the state, Jacinta Allen doubles down, repeats her pattern of behaviour and appoints a mate to run the implementation around one of the most important policy areas in our state, the delivery of housing for Victorians who need a roof over their head. Now, Jacinta Allen was offered many opportunities this morning to explain why Jerome Weimar has the requisite skills. I'm yet to understand why Jacinta Allen and her government think he's the best person for the job, when 1, his record is so woeful, but 2, Jacinta Allen cannot point to one thing that shows that Jerome Weimar has skills in delivering residential construction projects. The government said it wants to build 80,000 homes a year, yet it's put in charge a fellow who has no record of service in delivering housing and homes. This piece around offering homes to Victorians at prices and in places they can afford is something that requires the very best people with skills actually acquired in building homes or overseeing the construction of residential homes for Victorians. This isn't a game, Jacinta Allen. This isn't an exercise in vanity or jobs for mates. This is a critical policy area. And for people, it means the difference between living on the street perhaps and living in a home that they can afford, living a life that can make them happy, give them a sense of security, put them on a pathway to home ownership. And instead, what we've got is Jacinta Allen just playing games, looking after mates and thinking that we're not going to notice. This pattern of concealment that Premier Jacinta Allen has already put on full display has to stop. We saw it with Commonwealth Games when, with a straight face, she told Victorians that all was good, tremendous progress was being made. Well, didn't we learn the truth? We learnt the truth in a very difficult way. A cost of at least $600 million and lasting damage to our state's reputation from the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. And yet, what do we have now? The same kind of pattern of concealment. Jobs for a mate, a $500,000 job for a mate with no process. What did Jacinta Allen think? She was going to get away with it and no one would notice? That's not the way our government should run. Our government needs to be answerable to the people. And part of that accountability to the Victorian people is transparency. And when we don't get transparency, we get bad outcomes for Victorians. Because I can promise you this, if we are to go by the pattern of achievement that we've seen from Mr. Weimar, then we're not going to see the houses Victorians need. Just as we didn't see the Commonwealth Games, just as we saw the world's longest lockdowns with lasting, in some cases irreparable damage to Victoria's economy. And yet, Jacinta Allen has doubled down this morning. But importantly, Jacinta Allen now has questions to answer, because in the face of those questions, she has confessed to making at least 2 phone calls to her departmental secretary and discussing Mr. Weimar's appointment. We will be pursuing that because it's important that the Victorian people know that jobs which are there to serve them are not being handed out as part of some patronage scheme to support Jacinta Allen so that she can keep mates in jobs. The jobs that Mr. Weimar and people like him are occupying are there for the Victorian people to make sure housing is delivered, our hospitals run in ways where you don't have to wait months or years for surgery, or you don't have to wait too many hours for an ambulance, where you can drive on roads that are riddled with potholes. That's why this is important. This isn't some inside baseball dispute we've got with the government. This is about whether we have a government of integrity and transparency that will make sure the people who are put in these jobs are the best possible people, because I can promise all Victorians that if I become Premier, I will always commit to making sure we have the best people in these jobs, because the challenges our state faces are enormous and they grow bigger by the day. Whether it's housing, hospital, education, roads, infrastructure, you name it. Our population is growing very quickly, more quickly than the first of the intergenerational reports ever predicted. This is a time for transparency and scrutiny and honesty in government, and we're not getting it from Jacinta Allen.
Well, thanks very much, John. And today we've got a scathing report from the Grattan Institute when it comes to how the Allen government is failing our students in Victorian schools. 1 in 4 Victorian students cannot meet the proficiency standards when it comes to reading. 1 in 4 are graduating schools struggling to read. And today we've had the Minister out there playing the leaderboard when it comes to the states, instead of focusing on the fact that those students are leaving school without the basic proficiency standards. The Grattan Institute has put together a roadmap to how to lift those standards, has put a challenge to all states and territories to make sure we are putting in place the appropriate evidence-based learning in classrooms. And as part of that, the approach, they've put together the approaches across the country, highlighting states are actually putting in place this evidence-based learning. Every state is listed here except Victoria. We need to put in place an education system that's delivering for Victorian students, making sure they are graduating with the basic skills, the foundational skills that will ensure that they can get the jobs of the future. 1 in 4 students in Victoria cannot meet the reading standards when they graduate school. That is simply unacceptable, and the Minister needs to step up and make sure that evidence-based learning is put in every classroom in Victoria. Questions?
Just while you're there,
Yep.
Jess, Ben Carroll, the Deputy General, was basically saying that because we've got the second best stats in the country, that our team's better than the rest, even if they're doing this. Do you agree?
Well, Victoria is not doing this. This is what this report makes very, very clear. Victoria, in this report, has shown that they are muddying the water when it comes to learning approaches in classrooms. There are tests in place that do not meet the national standards and suggested standards. In Victoria, we only use 10 words compared to the 40-word standard across the nation. Victoria is failing students, and it's cold comfort to hear the Minister say that we are leading the country leaderboard when it comes to the outcome of reading, when 1 in 4 Victorian students cannot read in Victorian schools.
Thank you.
John,
Yes.
I guess you've obviously been quite critical of the appointment. Is there anything scrutiny-wise that can be done by Parliament to look into this appointment and whether there was a merit-based selection process?
Off the back of the Ombudsman's report last year into politicisation of the public service, we know there's an issue. So we will be pursuing this further when the Parliament resumes next week. We will obviously ask direct questions of the Premier, but we're not holding out much hope that the Premier will be forthcoming with the complete truth about what went on here. For example, we will now want to pursue what were the contents of the discussions she held with the Departmental Secretary. What pressure did she bring to bear to make it very clear to her secretary that Mr Weimar was to be appointed? We also have a very serious concern around chronology here. Mr Weimar occupied his role, we know, in relation to the Commonwealth Games. We know that he appeared before the parliamentary inquiry into the Commonwealth Games debacle in October. And we now see that he's been appointed to a $500,000 job without a merit selection process. We have very serious concerns about also the perception of that. Perception of jobs for mates and cronyism is something that has to be investigated now given the timeline. Gives his evidence, after he's given his evidence, the government appoints him to a job with a smooth transition into that job without even having to go through an interview. So there are integrity issues here, transparency issues that we will be pursuing in the lead up to Parliament next week and during next week.
Is it a bit of an overreach to blame Jerome Weimar for the Commonwealth Games? If anything, he was the one probably doing the numbers that worked out it was $6 or $7 billion, and when they accepted, the event, he had nothing to do with it.
The need to appoint the best person for the job is not only about skills and attributes. You want to make sure as government that you are appointing people who have the freedom and the confidence to speak truth to power. Now, there were a lot of people, it seems, who knew that the Commonwealth Games were becoming untenable throughout 2022 and 2023, and they didn't do enough to stop it. Ultimately, responsibility and accountability must rest and does rest with Jacinta Allen, who's never taken any responsibility for the debacle of Commonwealth Games cancellation. But the question then becomes, if Mr Weimar wasn't able to fulfil the broad expectations of the role he occupied in relation to the Commonwealth Games, when he had no previous experience of delivering a major event of that nature, what makes anybody think that Mr Weimar, no disrespect to him, has any capability to deliver residential construction outputs we need to make sure Victorians can access a home wherever they live at prices they can afford? Jacinta Allen, nor anyone else in her government, has been able to explain why Mr Weimar is the best person to fulfil this job. This is a big task, and it involves not only government, it involves working businesses, employees, unions, stakeholders, communities right across our state. No one has explained why Mr Weimar is the best person for that job. So my criticism is not of Mr Weimar. Everything I'm saying is a criticism of Jacinta Allen and her government, which continues to thumb its nose at integrity standards, transparency standards in our state. And is it any wonder that we continue to see performance decline in health, education, ambulance response times, this, housing targets, when you're not appointing the best people to these roles? That's why this is so important.
Jacinta Allen was asked today, obviously around those two conversations that she had, the first one being discussions of Jerome Weimar. She was asked if there were discussions of any other candidates in that conversation. She said she can't remember. What do you make of that answer?
Jacinta can't remember whether any other candidates were discussed in that phone conversation because there were no other candidates. Everybody knows that. This was Jacinta Allen looking after her mate and making sure, whether she did it subtly or very directly, she made it abundantly clear to her departmental secretary that Mr Weimar was getting the job, and he did.
If he was being canvassed for that job at the same time or around the same time that he was giving evidence to the parliamentary committee, would that be inappropriate?
We're very concerned because it would be highly inappropriate if someone like Mr Weimar was giving evidence when there had been discussions about the possibility of a senior role in government like the one Mr Weimar has been given. It's why we will be pursuing an investigation into the chronology of this matter, from the time Mr Weimar occupied the role in relation to the Commonwealth Games to the time he gave evidence, all of his conversations with the Premier or any other member of her government or anyone speaking on her behalf to him. now be the subject of our further inquiry. This is very serious. I think Victorians will understand that if you are giving evidence and there have been discussions about the possibility of a role after you've given your evidence, I think you would expect all Victorians to be concerned about that.
What form will that investigation take? Will that potentially be a parliamentary inquiry?
Quite possibly there are a few options that we will explore, but this needs to be investigated. Whether it can be part of the current inquiry of the Commonwealth Games, given that if discussions were occurring in relation to the evidence, it could conceivably form part of the ambit of that committee's work. But if it doesn't fall within the ambit of that committee, we will certainly look at another committee or other avenue to pursue it. It's too important to pass up. We can't have jobs being handed out to mates, particularly when they're giving evidence under oath to parliamentary inquiries.
Do you think there's grounds enough to refer this to either being ombudsman or either?
We're certainly very concerned at this point in time. We will want to see if we can elicit further information from the Premier about the nature of those discussions. For example, can she provide something close to a transcript of what she discussed with Mr Muir, her Departmental Secretary, on those two occasions, and any other communications. We don't know whether there were text messages, WhatsApp messages, emails, in addition to phone conversations. So we will look at every avenue we can to ensure that the truth comes out. Thank you very much.
Just one thing on stamp duty, if that's okay.
Yeah.
There's new PropAct data that says that this generation is paying 6 times more stamp duty than the last. The Premier today ruled out any changes to stamp duty in the May budget. Do you think that's a mistake?
I think the first thing the government should be focused on is making sure that there's enough supply to moderate the rampant growth in housing prices across Victoria in particular. We know that about 30 to 40% of the costs of constructing a house are state taxes. And so we've got to look at managing our economy better, given that Labor can't manage money, to make sure that price growth when it comes to houses and units is not running away from Victorians. We understand that the disposable income of Victorians is less of a multiple than it used to be when compared with house prices. And we know that house price growth has grown by far greater a rate than household disposable income. We understand all of that. The first thing the government should do is get the budget back in order so that we can start attracting investment that will see more houses built right across our state, a way that will moderate growth, and in a way which will make Victorians, the possibility of owning a home for Victorians, a far greater possibility, one they can actually realise. That's the first thing we want to look at. I think broad tax reform, I think that's a discussion for another day, but certainly the first priority of the government needs to be how can we get the costs of construction down and how can we get house prices and put down so they can be put in reach of Victorians across our state. Thank you very much.